Welcome to our first class of 2025, right? It's very appropriate that we're having this on the last night of Chanukah as well. So every festival has its mitzvahs, and it also has a message that it comes to teach us, to tell us. The mitzvahs, which is like the body of the festival, and then it has the message, which is kind of like the soul of the festival. And I'll give you an example in a moment. But if we just do the mitzvah without actually understanding the message, it's kind of like the body of the festival, but without actually having the soul of it. What do I mean? Let's say, for example, Pesach. What's the mitzvah of Pesach, of Passover? The main mitzvah on Passover is to eat matzah, right? To not eat chametz. Now, what's the message of Passover? That God took us out of Egypt, right? Which really, if you think about it, the message there is that God can intervene in our lives, that God does intervene in our lives, right? Because until then, people could have easily said, God is the creator of the world, and then he created the world and he let it run on its own. What Pesach, the Passover story, comes and shows us is that God interrupted nature to take the Jews out of Egypt. In fact, there's a parallel of the 10 plagues and how they correspond to the 10 statements that God used to create the world. Because God used 10 statements to create the world. For example, he said, let there be light, and then there was light. You see here, there's the mitzvah of matzah, to eat matzah, amongst the other mitzvahs. And then there's the message of Pesach, which is there is a God who has the power to intervene in our lives, to save us, to save us if we need help or anything. Now, if someone just eats matzah and doesn't look into the message, they're missing a big part of Passover. Same thing with, for example, Shavuot. What do we do on Shavuot?
We got a cheesecake.
Right. Shavuot is the dairy. Dairy is actually a custom. It's not a straight up law.
When we got the Torah.
Oh, there we go. That's the message of the Shavuot, is that we were given this Torah that guides us and tells us how to live our life. Sukkot, what's the mitzvah of Sukkot? To sit in the sukkah. Now, what's the message? This one's a bit harder. Right, so they correspond to when we came out of Egypt in the desert. We had the clouds of glory that God's protected us with the clouds of glory, and that's what the sukkah is supposed to remind us of, which again, the message of it is that God protects us, right? God protected us in the desert, and God protects us. That's why we leave the comfort of our home, which is, our home is our security, right? We leave it and we go in and sit in this temporary dwelling to remember that the real security doesn't come from our house or the money in our bank account or whatever else it is, or our investments, or whatever it is. It comes from God.
That we're all human beings and anything can befall anyone, no matter who they are, how rich they are.
Yeah,
then
nowadays we sort of rely on, the security of a house, of money in the bank, etc., etc. And it's good to once a year to go and remember, actually, those things are temporary, right? God forbid it should never happen, but people lose their money, people lose their homes, people lose all sorts of things. And also, if you look at the time of the year, you have Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which we haven't sort of discussed, but Rosh Hashanah is about when God judges us, we accept God as the judge of us and the master of our lives, right? Yom Kippur is when we get forgiveness, and Sukkot is when we sort of go out, we leave all that materialistic things that distract us from the spirituality, and we are surrounded by God's protection and love, and it is a hug from God. And it's if you think about it, what's less anxiety provoking? Let me put it that way. Know that I'm relying on the money I have in my bank account, or to know that I'm relying on God?
Less anxiety, we relying on God.
Yes, relying on God, because I'll explain to you why it's less anxiety provoking, because with the money in the bank account, we never know what can happen. There's always a risk, right? I remember talking to someone about something and they're like, we can't risk X, Y, Z. And I was like, that's not life, right? Like, there's always a risk in life. Whatever you do, there's always a risk. Maybe there's less of a risk, but there's always a risk. But with God, we know that God is only going to do for us what is good for us, right? It might not feel good, right? But it is good for us, and it's good for our soul. So it is less anxiety provoking to know that, I'm relying on a God who loves and cares for me and who's all powerful, right? The banks are not all powerful. Yes.
I don't think it's true for me because the bank account I can see and I can't see God.
It requires faith. And the bank account, I think, also requires faith, right? Because
No, but
you can't actually see the bank.
no,
You see stacks of money, like if you
no, but just knowing it's there gives me a sense of security. I mean,
Yes, it does give us, and I think most of us wouldn't be being honest with ourselves as we didn't say that, if we have a certain cushion in the bank, of course it gives us a sense of security. However, there is an element of risk with
Yeah.
it. There's actually research that shows that. They research like happiness, like who's the happiest person kind of thing. And they found that once a person has a certain amount of money, and I'm not sure how much that amount was it, but it wasn't a huge amount of money. More money doesn't equal
Right.
more happiness. So let's talk about Hanukkah.
we skipped
Like them now.
Yom Kippur.
We did skip Yom Kippur, you're right. And what's the
but it
message
is
of
to
Yom
me.
Kippur?
It is-
One of the most powerful messages of Yom Kippur is this concept of we can repent, right? What we did, what we have to do is we have to own up to what we did. It's not necessarily an easy process, but the fact that we can repent and we can become better and we can fix our mistakes is an incredibly powerful message of Yom Kippur. Now let's try and figure out what's the message of Hanukkah. And I'm going to make the question a bit harder for you because the parameters of the question are that it has to be a unique contribution of Hanukkah. Like it can't be a repeat of one of the other ones. So for example, if you were going to turn around to me and say that the message of Hanukkah is that, God can create miracles, I'm going to say, I don't like that one. Well, not that I don't like the message.
why? Because there was other miracles.
Because Pesach tells us that, and
Right.
one could argue that the miracles of Pesach were more spectacular than the miracles of Hanukkah. The sea split, right? So what's the unique message of Hanukkah? Why is it that we have this whole holiday that's celebrated? What is it trying to tell us? So there's two periods in Jewish history. There's a period where there was open miracles, like the splitting of the sea, the 10 plagues, etc., etc. And then there's the period of what's called Hestaponim, which means that there are no open miracles anymore. And this is the period that we live in right now. And it ended, the first period where the open miracles ended was around about Hanukkah time, right? When the time of the Hanukkah story. And now we have miracles, but people can explain them away if they so wanted to. Right? Like, for example, a lot of people that, they look at what happened when Iran bombarded Israel with the missiles, and it's like, that was obviously a miracle. I'm sure there are people out there that will deny that that was a miracle, right? That's a miracle it's a bit of a clearer miracle, but it's still a miracle that people can explain away and say, oh, the Iron Dome, or this or that or the other, right? So Evelina's raising a good point about that. We now live in a time when there are no more open miracles. Any other ideas?
What you said about Israel and the missiles. Excuse me. I talked to a friend whose son lives in Bet Shemesh and his family. And there was a missile that came, and some of the debris from it, which is huge,
Right,
from these bullets, fell in a very small little space that has no homes, a very small.
Rabbi Friedman told me the
Wow.
same story, and also the bomb or whatever it was, missile fell on like a few feet from the apartment building that one of his sons used to live in.
Wow.
Wow.
He said it was a Hanukkah miracle, but you're right,
Someone could explain it away, but I
Yeah.
mean, if you're looking at it with open eyes, you can see the miracle about it. So here's the thing, you all raised very good points. So this is what I want to do, is I've printed out over here the Al Hanissim. The Al Hanissim is the prayer that we add into the the Amidah and the Birchat Hamazon, the great after meals on Chanukah. So I'd like someone to read out to us the English, but before we read it out, this is what we're looking for. It's a little bit of an interesting prayer because there's something different about what this is written than most prayers that we read. Or, for example, if you remember what we say during the Seder, the Haggadah, it's just got something different about it. So kind of look at it when you're reading it. If you've never read it before, great. If you've read it before, pretend it's the first time reading it and see if you can spot something that's different about it. So who would like to read it out? Okay, thank you, Adam.
And we thank you for the miracles, for the redemption, for the mighty deeds, for the saving acts, and for the wonders which you have wrought for our ancestors in those days at this time. In the days of Mattityahu, the son of Yohanan the high priest, the Hasmonean and his sons, when the wicked Hellenic government rose up against your people Israel to make them forget your Torah and violates the decrees of your will. But you, in your abounding mercies, stood by them in the time of their distress. You waged their battles, defended their rights, and avenged the wrong done to them. You delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure, the wicked into the hands of the righteous, and the wanton sinners into the hands of those who occupy themselves with your Torah. You made a great and holy name for yourself in your world, and effected a great deliverance and redemption for your people Israel to this very day. Then your children entered the shrine of your house, cleansed your temple, purified your sanctuary, kindled lights in your holy courtyards, and instituted these 8 days of Hanukkah to give thanks and praise to your great name.
Now, it's a tricky question that I asked you, but I'm curious if anyone found anything interesting about this. For example, in the Haggadah, who do we talk about? In the Haggadah, we talk about God. We very, very rarely talk about Moshe in it, right?
The actual Haggadah.
Yeah.
Because it was God that did all the miracles, right? So the focus is on God. But if you look at this, right, it's very much there's quite a strong focus of the days of Mattityahu, the Maccabees, right? That you delivered the mighty into the hands of the weak, the many into the hands of the few, right? Your children entered the shrine of your house, cleansed your temple, purified your sanctuary, etc. Right? There's a very strong emphasis on what the Jews did. Why is this? Is because whereas Pesach comes to teach us that God desires to help us, Chanukah comes to teach us something slightly different, because in the Chanukah story, the Maccabees had to make the first step, right? They were the ones that stood up and said, you know what? We are going to fight for our right to practice as Jews, right? Mila Hashem Elai, whoever is for God, come fight with us. And they were a tiny, weak, pathetic army, really, fighting against the Greek people. But they were the ones that took the first step. And then God gave them the miracle. Same thing when it came to the temple. The temple was defiled, right? It was terrible. But they went in and they cleaned it. They found this tiny jug of oil. At that point, they could have looked at this jug of oil and said, it's going to take us a week to get new oil. Like, it's pathetic. There's no point. Forget about it. Let's not light it. But they chose to take that little jug of oil and light the menorah. The message of Hanukkah is God wants to help us help ourselves, right? That he wants to help us help ourselves. We have to take the first step, and then God will do the rest for us. And I think it's apt that we live in this time of where there isn't open miracles, and we can get so hung up on what is possible and what isn't possible. I was talking to someone about something last week, and they were like, it's impossible, you can't do it. But that's not our job. Our job isn't to sort of figure out, is it possible, isn't it possible? Our job is to do the things that we need to do, right? To take the steps that we need to do, and then trust that God is going to do the rest. And there's a fascinating story in the prophets, that there was a widow who was extremely poor. She had nothing, and she went to the prophet Elisha, and she said to him, I've got nothing to feed my family. Like, can you help me out, please? He said to her, he says, what do you have in your house? So she says, she looks around her house, she says, I've got a few empty pitchers, right? Nothing in them, a few empty pitchers, that's what I've got. And she says, okay, fine, no problem. Go to your neighbor and borrow a bottle of oil. And she went to the neighbor and she borrows a bottle of oil, and he tells her to start pouring the oil into the first pitcher, and it pours, and then she pours it into the next one. She keeps pouring, and it keeps pouring and not diminishing from it. And with that, she was able to have enough to barter, or however else the economy worked in those days, and have enough for her family. But what's fascinating about the story is that it's a miracle, right? You take a bottle of oil and you pour it and it doesn't go down. That's a miracle. And yet, even that miracle, Elisha said to her, you have to provide something for it, right? You have to take the first step. You have to bring the pictures of the empty pitchers, and then the miracle will happen. And then, right? So when it came to the splitting of the sea, God told the Jews to walk, right? And the Nachshon ben Aminadab, who was the person who took the first step, he walked in all until the water got up to his neck, and only then did the water split. Right? So you're pointing out the same point, that God desires to help us help ourselves. It's just the focus of the message of Pesach is more about, look at the miracles God did. Whereas the focus of the message of Chanukah is, look at the Maccabees, right? Look at what they did, right? And again, I want us to take a moment and just understand for a moment the miraculousness of it, because we think about the Maccabees. They're a few weak, puny rabbis, right? Can you imagine that? Like a few puny
rabbis.
Yeah, a group of Chabad rabbis, right? A small group of Chabad rabbis, right? Or whatever, it doesn't matter which sect they come from, right? Going and fighting a well-trained army, right? Imagine like a tiny group of rabbis going to fight the American army, right? It's ludicrous, right? It's a suicide mission, right? So and
Well, it's the same as Israel surrounded by enemies and advancing into Syria.
and more than that, because at least Israel has an army nowadays, right? So it's even more than that, right? So we have to understand the level of how miraculous it was, and we have to understand the bravery of the Maccabees. And I think it's something that we should try and it's the message of Hanukkah, right? That sometimes in our own lives, we are faced with things that are impossible or that feel impossible. And we can sit there and we can kind of think that it's impossible. And you're allowed to think all of that. And at the same time, we have to remember that our job is to do our best and trust that God will do the rest. I heard an amazing story that I'm going to share with you over the weekend. So there was a guy that I know who was single for a long time, couldn't find anyone, was single, most of his peers were getting married, and eventually finally he found a wife, and they got married. And unfortunately the marriage was a disaster. He went through a very, very traumatic divorce afterwards. And at that point, it would be totally understandable if he throws his hands up and says, that's it, I'm done. I never want to get married again. I never want to have a relationship again. And he really focused on his relationship with God. And there's a concept in Judaism that if you need something and you know someone else that needs the same thing, then you should pray for the other person and you get answers first. And where this comes from, the story it comes from is from when Abraham and Sarah didn't have a child yet, and Avimelech had captured Sarah and kidnapped her. And as a result, God brought a plague upon Avimelech and his family, and they all became infertile, right? They couldn't have kids anyway. And he gave Sarah back, and Abraham prayed for Avimelech and his family to be able to have kids again. And as a result of it, Abraham and Sarah had Isaac. Right. And what we learn from here is this concept that you pray for someone else and you can get answered first. So what he said is that for himself, he didn't pray to find a wife again. Instead he prayed for himself that, God, whatever you give me, help me come to peace with it. Right. Which I thought was a beautiful, beautiful prayer to have, because the truth is we never know what God has in store for us, right? It's great to pray for what we want, and it's also great to pray that we can accept what God gives us, because we never know if that's going to match up. And he prayed for his friends who needed it to also find their shidduch, their b'shemet. And he found his girl, and they got engaged, and he's getting married shortly. And again, it's a beautiful story, because there's a part of it that's, it's so easy to give up when you get to a point, right? The Jews, they could have given up and said, you know what, like, it's a suicide mission, forget about it. We'll practice Judaism in secret, right? They could have done that. But even that would have required a tremendous amount of bravery to say, you know what, we'll just do our thing silently and in secret. We hope we won't get caught. But that wasn't good enough for them. They said, no, we are going to fight for Judaism. We are going to fight for the right to practice our Judaism. And they didn't give up. And God brought this miracle. And then again, when it came to the temple, to the oil, they could have given up. They could have, like, what would we do? What would you do if, you clean up the temple, you find this small jar of oil, you know it's going to take a week to get a new oil. What would you do? Ration it, maybe? And,
That's
right. And it took tremendous amounts of bravery for them, and courage, and also just like saying, we're gonna do our part, right? Our part is to light the candle, and then God will do the rest. There's and we see this throughout history as well. For example, in Germany, 19th century, it seemed like traditional Judaism was dying out. Right? No one was interested in being traditional or interested in traditional Judaism at all. And there was a rabbi called Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. So he lived a couple of hundred years ago in Germany. And what he did is, him and a group of maybe 11 people said, you know what, we're going to set up an Orthodox, a traditional minyan. And within 40 years, and it was impossible. It was an impossible mission, right? No one was interested in what they had to offer. Within 40 years, they became a congregation of 500 people, right? Joining and growing. And they did it. Why? Because they said, we're going to do our best, and we're going to trust that God will do the rest, right? We don't know what's going to happen. It's easy for us, when we know the rest of the story, to kind of say, okay, yeah, to root for them and say, yeah, go do it. But they didn't know the rest of the story. They easily could have failed, but they said, we're going to do our best and trust that God will do the rest. Each of us, I'm sure, in our own way, has places and things which kind of feel impossible. Sometimes it comes up, right? Like during classes or other times, people will say, like, there's so much to learn, there's so much to do in Judaism. It can feel so totally overwhelming. The same idea is here, right? God desires to help us help ourselves, right? We have to take out the first step. We have to do our best, and then God will do the rest, right? Like, there's so many stories of people who have accomplished. I have a friend from one of the places where I lived in previously, and at the time, she had 4 youngish kids, and her husband was anti-Judaism, right? They were both Jewish, but her husband wasn't like what Parav, but he was anti-Judaism. And she is still is incredible, but like, she was so committed to that. She wanted to be proudly Jewish, and she wanted to raise her kids as Judaism. And if you would have asked me at the time, I would have told you, she's got an impossible mission, right? The husband's so anti. Like, how do you raise kids in a family where the husband is so anti being Jewish and anything to do with Judaism? And yet, I don't know her story, but she did it, right? So her kids are all proudly and committed Jews, and she is, and her husband is. She did her best, and God did the rest, and like, the impossible kind of happened. It's interesting. I want to share an analogy to it as well, is that off the coast of Japan, like thousands of miles off the coast of Japan, there are 2 tiny little islands. The Japanese government has spent a fortune, like millions of dollars, to protect those islands from sinking into the ocean, even though nothing grows on those islands. Any idea why? Why would they put so much money into protecting those islands. The reason why they do that is not because they care about the islands particularly, but because those islands are there, it makes all that ocean up to it their territory. And that's valuable fishing territory and space for them, right? And the analogy is powerful because sometimes we kind of feel like I'm only one person or it's only one thing. Like what can I achieve? Right? Let's say someone's trying to take on lighting Shabbat candles, or someone's trying to take on, this particular thing kosher, whatever it is. There's so much out there, and I'm taking on this one thing. Like, what does it make a difference? But one person doing what we can to keep ourselves afloat and to not be swept aside from the water is valuable, right? And all we have to do is our best, trust that God will do the rest, because as Chanukah teaches us, God desires to help us help ourselves. And it's no coincidence that Chanukah is at the time where the winter starts, right? I know it feels like it's been winter for a while, but winter actually just started last week or so, 10 days ago. And winter is dark and it's cold. And it's time where you give up a little bit more. But the Chanukah message is teaching us this. It's teaching us that God desires to help us help ourselves. It doesn't matter if it feels impossible. What we have to do is we have to do our best, and we have to trust that God will do the rest.
Well said.
Thank you.